For almost 40 years, people sat in a quiet room in Zurich and said different versions of the same sentence to Carl Jung. I thought I knew them. Different accents, different decades, different griefs, the same sentence. And Jung noticed something almost nobody wants to hear. Most of these people had not been lied to. They had been mourning someone who was never fully there. Because the human mind does not meet people, it meets fragments, and then it quietly finishes them. You are not shown a person when you meet someone. You are shown a surface, and your mind does the rest of the work in the dark. A steady voice becomes proof of character. A good listener becomes proof of loyalty. One moment of being understood becomes proof that someone finally sees all of you. None of that was information. All of it felt like information. And that is the quietest form of self-deception there is. Not lying to yourself about who someone is, filling in who they might be. You have done this. You already know you have done this, even if you have never said it in these words. There was a person you thought about more than you spoke to. There was a version of them living in your head that was warmer, more patient, more available than the one who actually answered the phone. Between the one in your head and the one who answered the phone sits a gap. Most of your disappointment has been manufactured inside it, not by them, by the distance. Jung called this projection, and the word has been softened almost to meaninglessness. It does not mean you imagined someone entirely. It means you took something unlived inside yourself and hung it on a stranger who happened to be standing in the right light. The tenderness you never received, the confidence you never built, the version of your life you keep postponing. You did not fall in love with a person, you fell in love with a location for your unfinished parts. Here is what makes it so difficult to catch. Projection does not feel like fantasy from the inside. It feels like certainty. It arrives with a physical sensation, a quickening, a sense of recognition so strong you call it fate. That is not intuition. That is your own psychology, introducing itself to you through the face of another human being. The strongest feeling in your body is not always evidence. Sometimes it is only volume. You can see it once you know the shape of it. The person who told you almost nothing about themselves, and somehow you described them to your friends in detail. The one who was inconsistent, and you called it depth. The one who withheld, and you called it mystery. Silence is the most common canvas. People rarely idealize someone who talks too much about who they really are. That is why the least available person in the room is so often the most romanticized. Notice that none of this has been about romance. You have romanticized bosses. You have romanticized friends. You have romanticized parents long after the evidence stopped supporting it, because the alternative was grieving something while it was still standing in front of you. The mind will choose a beautiful lie over an ordinary truth almost every time, not out of stupidity, out of self-protection. None of this began with anyone you have dated. It began much earlier, in a house where you had no other option. A child cannot afford an accurate parent. If the person responsible for your survival is unreliable, the mind does not conclude that they are unreliable. It concludes that you have not yet earned the good version. So you learn to hold a picture of someone against the evidence and to call that picture love. That is not a flaw you developed. That is a skill you were issued. That skill came with you into every room you have entered since. You are not attracted to inconsistency. You are fluent in it. You know the choreography, the waiting, the reading of tone, the small adjustments that used to restore the warmth. Familiarity is routinely mistaken for chemistry. It has no interest in whether the familiar thing was good for you. That is why the one who calms you and the one who activates you are so rarely the same person. Because an idealized person is not a compliment, it is a job description they never applied for. You hand someone a role, you wait for them to perform it, and when they behave like a human instead of a symbol, you experience it as betrayal. They did not change. Your projection ran out of runway. Collapse never arrives loudly. It arrives in administrative details. A reply that takes a day longer than it used to. A joke that lands 2 degrees too sharp. A conversation where you notice, for the first time, that you are the only one asking questions. You do not lose the illusion in one moment. You lose it in 100 small corrections you keep declining to make. So you translate. Everyone does this, and almost nobody notices themselves doing it. Neglect becomes busyness. Contempt becomes honesty. Disappearing becomes needing space. Cruelty becomes a bad week that has now lasted 3 years. Translation is how the image survives contact with the person. You will keep translating for exactly as long as the illusion is cheaper than the grief. Something uncomfortable is buried in nearly every one of these stories. You knew, not all of it, and not early, but earlier than you have ever admitted out loud. There was a specific evening, a sentence that did not sit right, a small, precise moment where something in you registered the truth and then filed it somewhere you would not have to look. You did not lack information, you postponed it, because acting on it would have cost you the picture. Somebody tried to warn you. There is usually exactly one, and you remember who. A friend who asked a slightly too direct question. A sibling who went quiet when you described the good version. Someone who said one careful sentence and then never raised it again, because they could see it was not welcome. You did not ignore them. You defended against them, which is much more active. Nobody protects an accurate picture that hard. The ones you defend to the point of losing a friendship are always the ones you built yourself, because underneath all of it sits something more disturbing than loneliness. You do not romanticize people because you think highly of them. You romanticize them because you need the world to contain someone capable of saving you from your own life. That is not affection, that is recruitment. And Jung understood something brutal about this. The psyche will invent whatever it cannot yet build. Every idealization is a confession about what you are not doing. You admire discipline in someone else because your own is unbuilt. You admire their freedom because you have not taken yours. You admire their certainty because you cannot yet tolerate your own doubt. The traits you worship in others are usually the traits you have exiled in yourself. That is why admiration so often turns to resentment. The mirror stops flattering and starts accusing. If you have lived long enough, you have already met these people. You called them something kinder at the time. The mentor who was generous until you outgrew them. The friend who was only warm when you were struggling. The partner who loved the potential in you and disliked the person who eventually arrived. None of them were villains. All of them were casting. Because this runs in both directions, and that is the part nobody accounts for. While you were building a version of them, they were building a version of you. 2 people can spend years in a relationship with 2 people who do not exist. When it ends, both of them will honestly say they were deceived, not because anyone lied, because nobody was ever fully seen. If something in the last few minutes has already made you slightly uncomfortable, that discomfort is recognition, not disagreement. Leave a like so this reaches the people still calling that feeling something else. You can test this in a single question, and the answer usually arrives faster than you would like. What do you actually know about them that you did not infer? Not what they said they valued. What they repeatedly chose when choosing was expensive. Most people cannot answer. That is not a failure of memory. It is evidence of how little the image required. Because people are not hiding. This is the strange part. They tell you who they are constantly, in the least dramatic possible ways, in what they find funny, in how they speak about someone who is not in the room, in what they do the moment being good stops being observed. Character is not revealed in crisis nearly as often as people claim. It is revealed in low stakes, repeated, when nobody is grading. You were given the data. You preferred the portrait, because once an image is built, it starts protecting itself, and it does so without informing you. You will remember the one good weekend and forget the 11 ordinary ones. You will treat their best moment as their true self and every other moment as an interruption. You will quote something kind they said 4 years ago as though it were still in effect. That is not memory, that is maintenance. An idealized person is never disproved by evidence. They are only ever abandoned by exhaustion. One specific behavior always accompanies this, and it is usually mistaken for generosity. You start giving to the version of them you built. You are patient with someone who has not been patient. You are loyal to someone who has not been tested. You are understanding toward behavior you would not accept from anyone you were seeing clearly. That was not kindness. That was rent, paid monthly, on an image. Nobody thanks you for it, because they never asked for the building. Once you understand this, something in your perception changes permanently. You stop asking whether someone is a good person. You start asking what conditions they have been tested under, and which ones they have never once faced. Because nearly everyone is kind when kindness is free. Most people are loyal right up until loyalty costs them something. Goodness that has never been priced is not goodness, it is circumstance. None of this turns you against people. It only stops you from grading them on a test they were never given. That is not cynicism, that is accuracy. Jung described something that sounds abstract until you watch it happen to you. He said the psyche carries inner figures, patterns of the ideal partner, the ideal friend, the ideal father, assembled long before you met anyone. You do not build these in adulthood. You inherit them, absorb them, and then spend years looking for someone to wear them. So when you meet someone who fits even 10% of the pattern, your mind supplies the other 90. That is not love at first sight. That is pattern completion at first sight. The closer the fit, the more dangerous it becomes. Because a partial match is more compelling than a perfect stranger, and more compelling than an honest one. It gives your mind just enough material to build convincingly. The people who devastate you are rarely the ones who were nothing like the image. They are the ones who were almost it. Almost is what keeps you there for years, but there is a second contract underneath the first one, and it is the one nobody reads. To keep the image of them intact, you had to maintain an image of yourself, the easy one, the understanding one, the one who never needed too much. You were not only romanticizing them, you were auditioning for the right to stand near the person you had invented. Leaving costs you 2 people. That is why it takes so much longer than it should, because performance is expensive in a way that does not show up until later. You edited your reactions. You pre-approved your sentences. You let things pass in the moment and processed them alone at 2 in the morning. Some of that was maturity. Most of it was maintenance. That strange exhaustion after certain people is not introversion. It is the cost of keeping a version of yourself running. Here the picture becomes uncomfortable. If your image of them required an edited version of you, then the relationship was never between two people. It was between two performances, negotiating. Nothing real was ever refused, because nothing real was ever offered. That is why the ending felt hollow, rather than tragic. There was less there than either of you defended, because when it collapses, you will insist you are grieving a person. You are usually grieving a forecast, the holidays you had already imagined, the version of your future that had them in it, the self you were going to become once they finally arrived properly. You are not mourning what happened, you are mourning what you had already spent. This is why the pain sometimes arrives months late, long after you were supposed to be finished with it. The mind can accept a person leaving quickly. It cannot accept the deletion of a future it had already built rooms inside. That is why you can be over someone and still ambushed by them. Not because you want them back, because something in you is still holding a blueprint. Jung wrote about the withdrawal of projection, and the phrase is far colder than what it describes. It means taking back everything you loaned someone, the depth, the meaning, the significance. All of it was yours, and you have to carry it again. That is why the end of an illusion feels like poverty rather than freedom. You did not lose them, you repossessed yourself, and it was heavier than you remembered. Jung wrote one sentence about this that has never stopped being accurate. Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. Read that slowly. Your unknown face. Every person you have idealized was showing you something about yourself that you had not yet agreed to look at directly. Most people never reach this stage. Not because they lack intelligence, because the illusion is more comfortable. It is easier to believe you were betrayed than to admit you were building. Betrayal has a villain. Building has an author. Nearly everyone chooses the villain because choosing the author requires something of you. That is why people who stop romanticizing become slightly difficult to be around. They stop supplying the missing pieces. They ask the second question. They notice the sentence that everyone else politely lets pass. None of that is experienced as insight by the people around them. It is experienced as coldness, because the person who no longer fills in your gaps is holding up a version of you that you did not authorize. There is a reason clarity costs you invitations. The friend who needed you to admire them uncritically. The relative whose story only holds if nobody checks it. The partner who needed your idealization to keep their own doubts quiet. You did not become worse company. You became harder to use as a mirror. People rarely forgive that consciously. They drift and call it life getting busy. Because a person who sees accurately becomes structurally inconvenient. Someone who no longer needs the fantasy cannot be bought with attention. Someone who tracks patterns instead of promises cannot be managed with apology. Someone who has already grieved the ideal version of you cannot be threatened with its removal. That is not power over people. It is the end of leverage over you. Somewhere in the last few minutes, a specific face appeared in your mind. You do not have to name them. Just leave one word in the comments describing what you finally saw. This is not only a romantic problem, it is loudest there, which is why it gets mistaken for one. You have a friend you would describe as close, and if you were honest, the closeness happened years ago and has been coasting since. You are not friends with them. You are friends with a version of them from a period that has ended. That is why some reunions feel strangely flat. Two people meeting to maintain an archive. Doing it upward is even more expensive, and you have done plenty of that. The manager whose approval you organized your year around. The founder whose vision you mistook for character, the senior person whose attention felt like proof that you were finally becoming something. They were not evaluating you. Most of them were surviving their own week. You spent years performing for an audience that was, at the time, thinking about something else entirely. One specific conversation is avoided by nearly every idealized relationship, not an argument, an audit. Nobody sits down and says, "Here is what I need, here is what I am able to give, and here is what I have been quietly hoping you would become." That conversation is avoided because both people suspect the answer, and a shared silence is often the only thing holding two people together. Once the projection is withdrawn, you start noticing categories you were previously blind to. There are people who like you. There are people who like how they feel around you. There are people who like what you do for the version of themselves they are maintaining. Three completely different relationships. All of them use the same vocabulary. That is why the words never warned you. They were never the signal. Praise starts sounding different once you can hear it. You are so easy to talk to. You are so strong. You never make things complicated. You are the only one who understands. Those are not observations. Those are role assignments, delivered in the friendliest available packaging. Listen to what a compliment is asking you to keep doing. That is usually the whole message. Because affection tied to usefulness always announces itself eventually, and always in the same way. It arrives when you fail. It arrives when you set a boundary. It arrives the first time you need something instead of providing it. Not through confrontation, through a change in temperature nobody will admit to. You will feel it before you can prove it. That feeling is data. You will be told you are imagining it. You may even be told it kindly. Nothing has changed on paper. The messages arrive on time. The plans still get made, and every word anyone says is technically correct. But something has gone out of the room, and you can feel it in your body before you can name it in a sentence. Trust that. It is rarely wrong, and it is never provable. The terrifying part is not that people are pretending, it is that most of them are not. They believe the warmth. They mean it in the moment. The affection is real and conditional at the same time, and both of those facts survive contact with each other. That is far more disorienting than malice. Malice, you can name. Conditional sincerity reorganizes itself around whatever you are currently worth, without announcement. That does not make people fraudulent. It makes them situational, which is what human beings have always been. You were not deceived by a species. You were briefly confused about its terms. But this is where most people misread Jung completely, and it is the reason so many stop halfway. Seeing the illusion in other people is the easy half. It costs very little. It even feels like growth. The real horror begins when you notice you have been on the other side of this the entire time. Because someone has romanticized you, and you let it happen, because it was the most flattering thing that had happened to you that year. You noticed they had you slightly wrong. You noticed they were describing someone more patient, more solid, more certain than you have ever been. Correcting them never occurred to you. You performed the gap instead. That moment usually arrives quietly, and always with specifics. You have withheld a reply to feel briefly in control. You have been relieved by someone's failure and called it concern. You have performed steadiness while privately unraveling. You have stayed in something you had already left, because leaving would have made you the person who left. None of that makes you cruel. All of it makes you human, in exactly the way you were refusing to allow in someone else. At that point, the cleanest version of your own story stops holding. You were never only the one who was idealized and then abandoned. You were also the one who idealized, extracted, and quietly disengaged when someone stopped fitting the shape you needed. Both, usually in the same decade, sometimes in the same relationship. This is what Jung meant by the shadow, and it is far less dramatic than people want it to be. It is not evil, it is not a hidden monster. It is the ordinary material you decided was incompatible with the person you were trying to be. The envy, the scorekeeping, the need to be chosen over someone else. The small satisfaction when a person who dismissed you struggles. Repression does not remove those things. It only removes your supervision of them. Because whatever you refuse to look at does not stop operating. It stops informing you. It shows up as your taste in people. It shows up as who you find magnetic and who you find boring. It shows up as the fourth relationship with the same architecture and a different face. You did not have bad luck 4 times. You had one unexamined pattern with 4 casts. This is the mechanism nobody wants attributed to themselves. Hiding is not the only thing the shadow does. It also chooses. The part of you that never received attention will select someone who withholds it, because winning it would finally settle the question. The part of you that felt like a burden will select someone who needs managing, because being needed is safer than being wanted. You did not have a type. You had an unfinished argument, and you kept hiring people to lose it with you. Because there is one thing keeping a large number of people attached to a person they no longer even like. You are waiting for the acknowledgement, not the relationship, the sentence, the moment where they finally say what happened and confirm you are not imagining it. That sentence is very rarely coming, not because they are cruel, because they genuinely do not remember it the way you do. You are waiting for a witness from someone who was never in the room you were in. One more layer sits underneath, and nearly nobody reaches it. You have been romanticizing yourself the entire time. The version of you who would have handled it better. The version who was always acting in good faith. The version who was the reasonable one in every ending. That person is a projection too. And protecting him has cost you more relationships than any of the people you blamed. Because the most expensive story you tell is the flattering one. You remember your reasons and their behavior. You remember your context and their choices. You remember what you meant and what they did. That is not dishonesty. That is the standard architecture of memory, and it is running in them too. Everyone is the reasonable narrator of a story where somebody else is difficult. This is the line most people will refuse. Some of the people you have privately written off as shallow, cold, or dishonest were only human at a moment when you needed them to be a symbol. They did not fail you. They declined a role. Recognizing that does not mean everyone deserved you. Some people were exactly what you eventually understood them to be, and clarity about them was earned. It means the count is lower than your story requires. Self-awareness does not make you innocent. It makes you accurate, which is the only thing that has ever changed anything. This changes what forgiveness is, because the version most people were sold does not work. Forgiveness is not deciding it was acceptable. It is not a gift you hand someone who never asked for it. It is the moment you stop requiring a different past in order to have a functional present. Most people are not withholding forgiveness. They are still negotiating with something that has already finished, because once you can see your own machinery running, something previously impossible becomes available. You stop needing people to be consistent in order to be real. You stop requiring an apology in order to be finished. You stop needing to decide whether someone was good, because you are no longer casting. The person in front of you becomes legible, and your distance becomes a choice. That single ability will change more of your life than any insight about other people ever will. The ground moves one last time. If your view of others was constructed and your view of yourself was constructed, then every relationship you have ever had was two constructions negotiating over a table neither of them looked under. That is not a tragedy. That is the ordinary condition, and it has been running since long before you. The only variable is whether anyone in the room is willing to look. There is probably one person who needs to hear this before they find out the slow way. Send it to them without explaining why. They will understand by the end. Because after this, something separates you from most conversations you will have. You will hear someone describe a person they have just met, and you will hear the construction happening in real time. You will hear the adjectives arriving faster than the evidence. Saying something would not help. Nobody has ever been talked out of a projection. It has to be spent. A grief comes with this that nobody around you will recognize as grief. You are not mourning a death. You are not even mourning a relationship in most cases. You are mourning a belief about how people work, and beliefs do not get funerals, so you carry it privately, and people ask why you seem different. Not sadder, older, in the specific way that only accurate information ages someone. The world starts sounding different after this. Not quieter, thinner. Conversations you used to enjoy start revealing their mechanism. You notice how much of social life is two people agreeing not to check. That is the first real cost of seeing clearly. It is not loneliness. It is the loss of easy company. Hardest of all is not the person you can walk away from. It is the one you cannot, and never will be able to. The parent who will never become the version you have been waiting 30 years for. The sibling who will always narrate your childhood incorrectly. The family member everyone has agreed to describe generously, because the alternative is a conversation nobody survives. You do not get to end those. You only get to stop expecting them. Strangely, that is where most of the relief lives. Because none of this makes you finished. That is the part people are never told. You will understand every word of this, and then meet someone next spring who says one accurate thing about you at the right moment, and you will feel the machinery start again. That is not failure. That is a psyche doing what it has always done. The difference is that you will now recognize the sensation while it is happening, instead of 3 years later at somebody's wedding, because there is a particular loneliness that only arrives after the illusion is gone, and it is the one nobody warns you about. You are no longer lonely for company. You are lonely for someone who does not require a version of you. That is a much smaller category. Most people have 3 of those in a lifetime, and usually do not notice which 3. This is where a large number of people go wrong permanently. They mistake disillusionment for wisdom. They decide that suspicion is a personality, that distance is intelligence, that expecting the worst is being well-informed. It feels like armor. It functions like a wall with no door. The person who cannot be fooled has usually just made themselves impossible to reach. Because cynicism is persuasive in a way that optimism never is. It is rarely wrong out loud. Suspect everyone, and you will occasionally be right and never be humiliated. Assume motives, and you will never be surprised. Expect nothing, and nothing can be taken. It is a perfect system. It costs you everything it was designed to protect. Something else is true, and the cynic never admits it. Cynicism is not the end of romanticizing. It is romanticizing inverted. You are still deciding who someone is before they show you. You have only changed the direction of the invention. The idealist builds a saint from 3 data points. The cynic builds a fraud from 2. Neither one has met anybody. Clarity and suspicion look nearly identical from the outside, and they function as opposites. Suspicion assumes, and clarity waits. Suspicion needs to be right, and clarity is willing to be corrected without losing anything it cannot afford. Suspicion protects a story. Clarity has stopped requiring one. One closes the case early and calls that being realistic. The other has stopped predicting, which is a different thing entirely. In practice, this is far less dramatic than people imagine. You still care about people. You still get it wrong. You still occasionally admire someone more than the evidence supports, because being human did not become optional. The difference is your response time. You notice the construction earlier. You correct it faster. You stop spending years on something you can now recognize in months. That is the entire upgrade. It is not immunity. It is speed. Meeting people does become different, though not in the way it sounds. You stop deciding early. You let someone stay unresolved for longer than is comfortable. You give weight to what repeats and none at all to what impresses. The question of whether someone can be trusted was always unanswerable. What they do when trusting them would be inconvenient is not. Slower, less thrilling, considerably more accurate. Understanding this once changes very little. Understanding it repeatedly changes everything. Subscribe, because this only works as a slow, continuous return to the same mirror. Because when the projections come down, something takes their place, and it is not emptiness. It is proportion. People become the correct size for the first time. Nobody is your salvation. Nobody is your ruin. Everyone is a person, carrying a private situation you will never fully be shown. That sounds cold written down. In practice, it is the first restful thing that has ever happened to your relationships. This is what Jung was pointing at, underneath all of it. The goal was never to see through people. It was never to become unreachable or unimpressed or safely disappointed in advance. It was to become conscious, to carry accurate information about human beings without letting it harden you into something smaller. That balance is far rarer than people think. Jung had a word for the whole process, and it has been marketed almost past recognition: individuation. It does not mean becoming better than other people. It means slowly withdrawing everything you have loaned out and becoming someone who no longer needs to store parts of himself in other human beings. The strength you admired, the certainty you envied, the warmth you kept looking for in rooms, all of it was always inventory. You were simply keeping it somewhere else. This is what makes real closeness so much rarer than people assume. Intimacy is not being adored. Being adored is comfortable and largely fictional. Real closeness is being accurately known by someone who has already seen the unflattering material and has not adjusted their behavior because of it. That takes years. It cannot be accelerated, and it is only available to people who have stopped performing long enough to be found. Because once the machinery becomes visible, it does not become invisible again. You will never fully return to the version of yourself who could build a person out of a good first conversation. That door closes quietly and permanently. Some of you will experience that as a loss. It is worth sitting with why. Things you previously walked straight past start registering. You notice how often warmth arrives right before a request. You notice which people become subtly different when someone more useful enters the room. You notice how many conversations are two people waiting rather than two people speaking. And you notice, without cruelty, that you have done every one of those things yourself. Because the real discovery is not that people wear masks. Everyone already suspected that. The discovery is that the masks were never the problem. Believing they were the person underneath is what cost you. Needing them to be permanent so that you could stop paying attention is what cost you more. Human beings are contradictory, and there is no version of this where that stops being true. Capable of devotion and calculation, capable of protecting you and resenting you, capable of meaning every word and outgrowing it within a year. Not two-faced, unfinished. And you are on that list, which is the part that makes the whole thing bearable. Perhaps maturity begins the moment you stop looking for people who will not disappoint you and start seeing people as they are, partial, inconsistent, doing their best inside a story you were never given, including you, especially you. Because the day you stop romanticizing people is also the day you stop asking them to finish something inside you that was always going to be yours to finish. You stop auditioning strangers for a role nobody has ever successfully played. That is when something strange happens to your vision. Not brighter, not darker, just accurate. You become slower to trust, but far steadier once you do. Harder to flatter, but far easier to be honest with. Less impressed by charm, less devastated by its removal. Less willing to abandon what you already knew, just to keep someone in the room. Very little of what you valued is lost in this. The capacity for devotion survives. The willingness to be moved survives. The part of you that wanted to love somebody properly was never the problem, and it does not need removing. Only the outsourcing stops. You keep the warmth. You simply stop mailing it to addresses you have never verified. Because now you understand the thing most people spend an entire lifetime carefully not understanding. The danger was never that people could deceive you. Your loneliness, your hope, and your unlived life were willing to do it first, and to do it in someone else's name. Once that is understood, people stop being shocking. They stop being heroes. They stop being warnings. They stop being evidence of anything except their own long, unwitnessed history. What is left is a human being, which, in the end, was all anyone was ever going to be. If this made you realize something uncomfortable about someone or about yourself, leave a comment with the word "clear."